So, good evening, everyone. Nice to be back again, talking to you on the subject of managing pigs in hot weather. For those that didn't take part in the last webinar, my name's Alex. I work at the George Veterinary Group and have worked with pigs for more than 10 years as a veterinary surgeon. So covering all different sizes and types of producer, from backyard pigs, pet pigs, right through to larger commercial organisations. Right, without further ado, we'll crack on. As we said, it's a topical subject at the moment. We've had quite a period of hot weather earlier on in the year, and we're looking like we're heading for another period now. So getting a few tips on how to manage pigs in hot weather and avoid any problems that might arise. Rough plan of what we're going to be doing this evening. We're going to be talking through how pigs regulate their own body temperature, to give some background about the physiology of what goes on, to give some context to the other issues we're going to talk about. How the environment that pigs are exposed to and live in can cause a problem in higher temperatures. How hot weather and heat stress affects different age groups of pigs, and how we can mitigate against those effects and make some changes to what we do in order to prevent those issues becoming significant problems to the herd. Everyone's classic phrase, sweating like a pig, but actually that's quite a misnomer, and we'll come on to that. So body temperature is regulated by is the process by which pigs produce body heat through metabolism, which is the way the body works effectively. Some of that heat is generated by the basic process of staying alive, breathing, digesting food, those sorts of things. And then you move on to the other metabolic processes, such as growth, lactation, and fetal development. All of those processes generate heat. And therefore, the pig has to develop strategies in which that heat is lost to maintain the ideal body temperature. The amount of heat generated by a pig is determined by different factors, such as the body weight, the food and energy that is taken in by that pig, and also the level of activity. Effectively, the larger the pig, the more heat they generate. Pigs lose heat through multiple different methods. Those of you familiar with physics will be more than aware of what these different processes are. The basics of radiation, convection, evaporation, and conduction, which is the way in which heat is transferred in all different ways. So it really is a misnomer, sweating like a pig. Pigs can sweat, but from a very small area on the end of their nose. So actually, they can't use sweating as a method of losing heat like many other animals can. They're also not particularly great at panting. As those of you familiar with dogs, particularly would see that a dog uses panting as a method of heat loss. But pigs, although they do pant, are pretty inefficient at doing this. So it's not an easy method to be relied on in order to dissipate heat. And if you can see your pigs panting, they're already getting to the point where they're too hot. They will use any available liquid they can get hold of in order to help cooling, such as their drinking water, mud wallows or water wallows if they've been provided, and on the less desirable side of things, urine and feces. So if they have nothing else, they will use those as a method of trying to put liquid on their body surface to aid with evaporative cooling. So the environmental conditions that a pig is exposed to are really important in aiding the process of maintaining and regulating body heat, but also they can work against the pig if they're not ideal, and therefore make body temperature regulation quite difficult for the pig. So what environmental conditions can cause an issue? Breaking it down into the different methods of heat dispersal. Radiation is the way in which heat is lost from the body to the surrounding area, and there needs to be a temperature differential between the body and that surrounding area in order to allow that heat to transfer away from the body. Therefore, if you have poor roof insulation or wall insulation in a building, the building itself will become quite hot when exposed to direct sunlight, for example, and therefore there isn't as much of a heat differential between the pig's body and the space around them. Likewise, pigs living outdoors, exposed to direct sunlight, that prevents radiation because they are exposed to direct heat from the sun in their outdoor environment. Convection is the process by which the air around the body is heated and therefore rises away from the body. If there isn't great ventilation or the airflow around the pig is poor, and in an outdoor setting, if it's a very still day, for example, there's no method by which that warm air can be carried away from the surface of the pig's body, and therefore it hinders the way in which convection can be used as a method of dissipating heat. The ventilation and airflow or breeze is required in order to change the air around the body for a fresh set of cooler air to then be heated to keep the process moving again. So a still day, although overall the temperature itself may not be particularly high, the lack of breeze makes it harder for the pig to regulate, and therefore heat stress may occur at lower temperatures than you would otherwise expect. Evaporation is the process which most people would be familiar with in terms of pigs and managing hot weather. This is the process of covering their bodies in some form of liquid, be it mud or water, and allowing the heat of the body to evaporate that liquid and then remove the heat from the body due to the change of state of the water on the body surface. So if there isn't access to a liquid to coat the body surface, it is obviously impossible for them to use evaporation as a method of cooling. Likewise, if you're operating on a day of really high humidity or an environment in a building which has become really humid, the ability for the moisture to evaporate because of the air already being dense with moisture makes the process difficult to complete. And likewise, a poorer airflow doesn't carry that evaporated moisture in the air away from the body to allow further moisture to be evaporated around the pig. And finally, conduction is the transfer of heat directly from the pig's body onto a surface which it's in contact with. So pigs having some exposed concrete, for example, to lie on, which is cool, would allow heat to move from the pig's body into the concrete because there's a differential between the two surfaces. And taking this into account, if there's a build-up of bedding which is full of manure, there will be a composting effect underneath the pigs which actually generates heat and therefore makes it even harder for conduction to occur as a process because there's heat coming back towards the pig from the surface underneath them, as well as the pig trying to lose heat into the surface, which it can't do. So in the context of buildings particularly, it's worth considering if there's any other items or pieces of equipment that are in use that can generate heat, such as lights or generators or anything else that puts heat into the environment, that on a hot day would further increase the temperature to which the pigs are exposed. So the question is, are they required for use on that hot day, or can they be used in cooler parts of the day where the pigs aren't already trying to lose excess heat? The most important thing across this whole presentation is observing pigs' behaviour. They will effectively tell you if they're uncomfortable, if their environment isn't working for them. Ideally, pigs will lie comfortably, just about touching each other with their feet or their backs. If they are attempting to spread themselves out really wide across the environment that they're in and get as far away from each other as possible, it's a good indication that they are struggling to deal with the temperature in which they're in, because they're trying to get as far away from all of the other pigs to try and lose heat. Bearing in mind, pigs generate quite an amount of energy and as in the form of heat. When they're all really closely stocked to one another, it is difficult to lose that heat, and they can become agitated. They can show abnormal behaviour. They may well dung in the wrong area to where you expect them to, because they're choosing to lie somewhere that's cooler, and maybe use the lying area that you've bedded as a dunging area because it's too hot to lie on the bedding, for example. So let the pigs give you an indication of what they're trying to cope with. Moving on to how hot weather can affect specific groups of pigs. All ages of pigs can be affected by hot weather. It's not really specific to one group or another. As I said at the top of the presentation, the bigger pigs are more susceptible to heat stress, particularly at slightly lower temperatures, because overall they generate much more body heat because they have a higher metabolic rate, or they tend to be the animals that are at a higher level of production. For example, a lactating sow will have a really high basal metabolic rate because she's producing milk, and therefore that is an energy generating process, versus a younger piglet who is growing and therefore generating heat, but its body size is such that that heat isn't yet particularly great. Also, the larger the animal, the larger the body size, the harder it is for them to lose body heat, because they have a poor body surface area to weight ratio, whereas a smaller pig loses heat quite readily because they have a better surface area to weight ratio in terms of heat loss. So in a way that works against larger size animals even more, because their body surface area to weight ratio is poor and they generate more heat than a smaller pig. So hence why they can become stressed at slightly lower temperatures. Saying that, all pigs can develop heat stress, and that is something I will cover specifically, exactly what heat stress is. But again, to give some context, each different age category has an ideal zone of temperatures in which they are most comfortable, which is known as the thermal comfort zone. At the bottom of this is the lower critical temperature, below which they become chilled and they start to lose productivity and potentially develop disease issues, because they're trying to generate heat and keep warm. And at the top end of this is something called the evaporative critical temperature, which is the top end temperature at which the pig is comfortable, above which they start to become heat stressed. Within the thermal comfort zone, they're best able to regulate their own body temperature without putting themselves into a position where they find it difficult, because the environment is curtailing their ability to lose body heat. As you can see from the table on the right, which I've taken from a document that was generated in Australia, which I've referenced at the end. So if you're interested in following up, I have put the references at the end of the presentation. It gives you an idea of the temperature range in which those animals will be most comfortable. So for example, this table is generated for those that are setting temperature controllers on buildings, to give an idea what temperature range to set those controllers at. But it gives you a good guide as to the temperature at which those different categories of pig will be comfortable. And you can see there's quite a marked difference between the suckling pigs who are on their mum and the lactating sows, and this reflects what I've been saying about the body size. The smallest pigs can withstand the higher temperatures because then they find it harder to maintain body temperature and therefore need a warmer environment, otherwise they get chilled more easily. Whereas the lactating sow, who's working hard to feed her piglets, generates a lot of heat and therefore would prefer to be in a cooler environment because of the amount of metabolic heat she's producing. Once the ambient temperature goes over the upper limit, the evaporative critical temperature, you start to see the behavioural changes and performance drops associated with heat stress. And once you get even higher than that, up to what's called the upper critical temperature, then you really are tripping into the realm of severe heat stress, which ultimately can lead to mortality, because the pigs get to a point where they are totally incapable of losing body heat sufficiently to regulate it back down to a temperature at which they're comfortable, and it starts to create a negative process within the pig's body. So heat stress as an entity manifests itself in stages. So you would initially see increased panting as the temperatures start to rise and the pigs are attempting to lose excess heat. As I said earlier on, pigs are pretty inefficient panters, so they do use this, but it isn't an ideal method of losing particularly vast amounts of heat. Because they don't need to generate any significant amount of additional heat, they will reduce their feed intake, because increased feed intake will increase the amount of metabolic heat they produce. So they reduce that, and therefore you start to see the performance related problems with reduced feed intake, lower growth rates, maybe lactating sows that reduce their amount of milk they're producing because their feed intake has dropped, and therefore piglets struggling with weight gain when they're on a mother whose milk supply is dropping. They will go to search for liquid in order to start the evaporative cooling process. So you'll find them splashing at drinkers, trying to make floor surfaces damp so that they can then wallow, or they will actively seek out wallows. As I said before, the behavior cue will be the pigs are trying to spread out from one another so that they're not in contact with other hot bodies that is inhibiting the loss of heat. They will lie on bare floor surfaces to try and conduct heat away. And you will, if you took the temperature of pigs in a increased ambient temperature environment, they will have an increased body temperature, and that body temperature continues to increase the more they struggle to dissipate heat. They can become dehydrated if they have inadequate access to water or an inadequate water available to satisfy their thirst, because they are hot and therefore want to drink more. And ultimately, these processes then progress to more significant and more severe issues internally, which can lead to sepsis and then ultimately death. And it is a sad fact that in periods of extreme weather, it is not uncommon for sow deaths to be recorded, particularly because of their large body size. Often they're lactating sows, as I've said, because they have that higher heat production. And it is something that we particularly warn pig keepers to look out for in periods of extreme hot weather, that you're very vigilant to the cues that the pigs are indicating that they might be too hot, because it might lead to mortality. Sunburn. Some of you may well be familiar with this. As a fair-haired person, I'm very familiar with sunburn. It's incredibly uncomfortable, and the same applies to pigs. Initially, you would see sun exposure causing skin reddening, that flushing appearance where the skin surface is becoming burnt by the direct exposure to sunlight. And if prolonged exposure occurs without any protection, any blocking of the sun's rays or any shade, that skin damage can progress from flushing to blistering. It can be incredibly painful. So in terms of treatment, in addition to trying to mitigate against the direct sun exposure in some way, the use of anti-inflammatories may well be indicated, particularly in more extreme cases, in order to help the pigs recover from sunburn that has occurred. It can be a precursor. It's a separate entity, but it can be a precursor to heat stroke and heat stress, as we've just discussed. And it's not just the realms of outdoor production. I have seen sunburn in pigs kept indoors that have access to areas that can have direct sunlight exposure. So and pigs have a tendency to want to lie in the sun. They quite enjoy having a bit of a sunbathe. So if they have the ability to do that in an indoor system, they can still get sunburn. Interestingly enough, although provision of wallows is extremely good in terms of helping with body heat loss in pigs, purely water-based wallows won't help prevent sunburn, because it's like children going to a swimming pool, an open-air swimming pool on a really, really hot day, that covering their bodies in water keeps them cool, but it doesn't actually protect them from the sun's rays. This is where mud wallows really come into their own, because that creates that layer of sunblock equivalent over the surface of the pig, which actually cuts out and puts a barrier between the sun's rays and the pig's skin. And we do have some people with maybe smaller sized herds or pet pigs that would consider using sunscreen if they can't make a wallow, or they haven't got sufficient space, or various reasons. It's just easier maybe for them to apply some sunscreen. And again, with the issues that we're going to talk about later on, starting with sunburn shows that there's been some excess heat exposure, and therefore later on down the line, after the period of sunburn, you may well see secondary issues developing, such as pregnancy losses, abortions, but these won't necessarily be immediately evident because it takes a while for them to manifest themselves. Dividing it down into the impacts of different sections and subsections of the herd, if you look at sows, heat stress and excess heat exposure can lead to reproductive problems. Embryonic death, therefore you might see more regular returns to service after a period of service. So if you're using AI, you might see a return 3 weeks later. Similarly, if you're using a boar, you might see them working every 3 weeks rather than working for a period and then having a break. Also, because you get embryonic death, if there's sufficient litter size, you might not actually lose the litter, but you might just see smaller numbers being born once the pregnancy reaches term. Can also suppress estrus, so you might have issues physically getting the pigs to come on heat and then getting them served. And then you might see some later stage losses, so abortions, late stage pregnancy losses. And as we've mentioned before, because the pigs are trying to reduce the amount of heat that they're generating, there's a propensity to reduce feed intake. And particularly this is important in terms of the lactating sow, because she is producing so much energy and so much heat because of milk production. She will reduce her feed intake, which then has a knock-on effect on the piglets that she's rearing. In terms of boars, they're really important not to be forgotten. They are quite significantly affected by changes in temperature, because the way in which the semen is stored in the scrotal sacs and the epididymis is temperature controlled. They try and regulate the temperature of the semen and sperm, so it's kept lower than their natural body temperature in order to keep it at the best quality. So if the ambient temperature is high, it's difficult to maintain this, and therefore you can see reduction in sperm volume and reduction in sperm and semen quality, as well as a reduced libido due to the hot weather. And it's important to remember, due to the semen and sperm production cycle, that following a period of hot weather, you can see reproductive issues due to poor boar performance for up to 8 weeks, until the new cycle has kicked in that wasn't affected by the hot weather. So it isn't something that only occurs during the hot weather, it is something that can then lag behind, causing more longer term issues if there aren't mechanisms in place to try and keep the boars cool. Seasonal infertility. It's quite a big topic, and a lot of people have either heard of it or have experienced it. It is not 100% heat and temperature driven. There is a relationship towards daylight length and melatonin production in terms of how that works with triggering the ability for the pig to breed. It tends to manifest itself in summer and early autumn as depressed fertility and reduced litter size in both sows and gilts. So for the reasons we've just discussed, due to embryonic death and late stage pregnancy losses, you see these reductions in performance. There are a number of ways in which it can manifest itself, and you could potentially see all of these or just a selection. Reduction in the number of pigs that are actually progressing forward to display puberty is quite a common issue, and a delay to the time at which they reach puberty. So they tend to mature slightly slower and be older at the point they actually go through puberty, which can have longer term knock-on effects in terms of performance. You get the poor estrus expression because it's suppressed due to the hot weather, and you might see an extended wean to service interval after you've removed the piglets and you're waiting to put the sows back to the boar. And you might see a higher rate of anestrus, which is basically a failure to cycle. So you see more animals that appear not to be cycling at all. And you might see an increase in pregnancy failures, be that irregular returns due to early embryonic death, or late pregnancy losses due to abortions, in which case you might see sows that have gone nearly to term and then they don't farrow down, or you see them lose a litter towards the end of pregnancy. The animals that are of most risk tend to be your older sows, and those sows which have a weaning service interval of greater than 5 days, and sows that are weaned particularly early, as well as those that are weaning lower litters. It's also worth bearing in mind, in terms of what we've discussed with respect to lactational feed intake, that the bedrock of the next pregnancy for that sow is actually put down in the later stages of lactation. So if she's struggling to intake feed because of the higher temperatures, and may well be losing body condition as a result of that, because she's still trying to feed her piglets despite maybe a reduced lactation level and milk production, she is still using energy and she is still producing, and therefore she might be reducing her body condition, which potentially puts her into what's called a state of negative energy balance, where she's not taking in enough energy and she's using her own body reserves in order to generate the milk and feed her piglets. If this is the case, this can affect the egg production and follicle production that's going on her ovaries, which is preparing her for the next cycle in her life, so the next litter that she's going to have, which might mean, as a result of the drain on her resources during lactation, she then goes on to have a smaller litter or a poorer return to service. Maybe she doesn't conceive on first service, for example, because she's struggled with the physiological return to normal during that later stage of lactation, because she's reduced her feed intake because she's too hot. So it's worth bearing in mind the impact of those things on the next litter, because those bedrocks are in place while she's suckling the current litter. So what do you do? How do you combat these things? With respect to seasonal infertility, focusing on heat stimulus and heat detection in order to try and be more vigilant and work harder to get animals to come on estrus when it is being partially suppressed by the warmer weather. If you're using AI, making sure that the storage of the AI is optimum from the point it arrives to you right through to the point at which it's being used. Heat shock will make the sperm move around more and use up the resources more quickly, which can deteriorate the quality of the AI. Checking for returns and doing pregnancy diagnosis will also early detect if you've got problems with pregnancy losses or conception rates. We've discussed why the nutritional intake during lactation is so vital, and making sure that you're minimizing the amount of mixing that you're doing after service, because that in itself can jeopardize pregnancies due to stress, and making sure that you've got cooling mechanisms in place so that you try and help the pigs to regulate their own body heat and keep them at a more comfortable temperature. And then working around, if you have a certain number of animals that you need to have farrowing at a certain time, thinking about whether you need to increase the number of animals that you're serving so that you still hit those targets, those farrowing targets, if you do have any issues with seasonal infertility. Making sure that any gilts coming forward in the system are attaining puberty at the optimum time and therefore being served at the optimum time. If they become late maturers, it tends to be an indicator that they are not going to perform particularly well or may well struggle to get in pig for that first pregnancy. So moving a little bit away from the breeding herd onto the feeding herd, all of the issues we've talked about in terms of heat stress and sunburn, they still apply to growing pigs as much as they do to the breeding herd. If they're exposed to direct sunlight, or if they are in an environment which hinders their ability to regulate their body temperature and remain comfortable, they will suffer from those things. But in terms of the specifics of what you're targeting with a feeding herd, which is growth rate and getting the pigs through to slaughter in an economic and appropriate period of time, you will see reduced feed intake for the reasons that we've discussed, exactly the same as with lactating sows. They don't need to generate as much basal metabolic heat, so they reduce their feed intake, so their heat generation is reduced. But this in turn reduces growth rate and therefore increases days to market. So providing growing pigs with methods in which they can remain cool and comfortable will help to maintain their performance indicators. So the next obvious question is, how on earth do I help to reduce the impact of hot weather? What do I do? What measures can I put into place? First things first, think about the accommodation, be it indoors or outdoors. Here are two examples of outdoor systems. Actually, these are both on the same farm. Certain areas it was harder to generate a wallow, and therefore they erected a shade system. So the pigs had somewhere to go that was outside and had a breeze flowing through the area, but still had a shade on so that they weren't exposed to direct sunlight. And then a wallow system, which allowed them to coat themselves in sunscreen in the form of sloppy mud. We mentioned at the beginning how the sort of physics of heat loss is impacted by the environment the pig lives in. So basics such as checking roof and wall and arc insulation and repairing that as necessary. You kind of think of insulation in terms of keeping them warm in hot weather, but actually insulation works both ways. If you have poor insulation in a building or an arc, it prevents the building from regulating its internal temperature, or the arc from regulating its internal temperature as effectively. So that internal space will heat up more because the surface is heated, and it transfers that heat more readily into the building because there's a lack of insulation. So making sure that insulated accommodation is functioning properly. A really common thing that we get a lot of our outdoor producers, or encourage all of our outdoor producers to do, is whitewash or white paint the outside surface of dry sow and farrowing arcs and any accommodation outside to act as a heat reflector. And you would be surprised how early in the year we actually ask people to do this, because the relative jump in temperature that can happen in spring when you get a really lovely warm spring day will potentially generate heat stress, because the pigs have just come through a winter and they're used to much cooler temperatures, and they will all lie out in the sun and bake themselves. So if you can give them somewhere cooler to lie when they want to, in the form of an arc which is reflecting the heat away from it rather than absorbing it all in, you can make a real difference. And a lot of work's been done to show that there is anything up to 7 degrees C temperature reduction from an arc that isn't painted to an arc that is painted, in terms of keeping the pigs cool. Making sure that buildings are well ventilated and have sufficient airflow in order to keep moving the warm air out and allowing that cool air to come through and help with evaporative cooling and convection. Obviously, if you're outdoors, you can't regulate the ventilation, but you would know if you're in an area which is particularly breezy or is prone to more still conditions due to the topography around you, and therefore you can modify what you do according to your topography. Getting more into things that some of the commercial guys consider, which is the installation of sprinkler systems, but that can be modified to a garden hose which has some holes punctured in it, so that you have maybe a drip system that you can utilize. It doesn't have to be anything particularly fancy, but some way in which you can provide that moisture that the pigs need in order to coat themselves in liquid and then use evaporative cooling. Bearing in mind the different stages of production, you might consider something that sprays in dry sows or gilts or growers, but you wouldn't use a spray in farrowing accommodation because you run the risk of chilling the piglets by making them wet. So in that system, you might consider something that drips over the sow, but doesn't actually make the piglet accommodation wet, so that they can maintain their nice warm bubble that they like, whereas the sow can have some cooling because they have completely different needs in terms of temperature requirement. Reviewing what happens with bedding levels. You don't want to leave the pigs without any bedding, particularly if they're in a house and therefore they need that as environmental enrichment as well. But if they've got a big deep duvet of straw and no bare concrete to have exposure to in order to use conduction in order to lose heat, it might be worth considering how you bed the pigs up so that there is an area they can use as floor contact so that they can lose heat. And think about removing the manure-soaked bedding underneath on a more regular basis so that it doesn't build up and it doesn't start to compost. This will generate heat underneath the pigs like an underfloor heating system, and makes it even harder for them to lose heat, and also will make them lie somewhere where you don't want to, and potentially dung somewhere where you don't want to, compounding the problem by adding extra manure on top of the composting bedding. Just for interest, I went through my pictures rather than this just being a presentation of endless words, to show some examples that I've seen in different parts of the world of methods in which buildings have been cooled. On the left, there's an evaporative cooling system, which was effectively a curtain at the end of a building, which had constant running water going over it, cold running water, and fans would blow air through that running water in order to cool the air coming into the building, to make sure that the pigs always had access to cool air. Also on the right, you can see an American big completely fan-powered building in which you just have a row of fans that draw air through to keep a constant flow of clean air through that building. Not suggesting that anybody's necessarily thinking of investing in something like that, but it's just examples of how different people deal with temperature in hotter parts of the world. As we've mentioned before, with respect to seasonal infertility, don't forget the boars. Don't forget the semen storage and handling facilities. Focusing on the pigs and their welfare and well-being is obviously vital, but don't forget the other things in the periphery which are also affected by high temperatures, which will compound some of the production issues that can follow on from higher temperatures. Thinking about reducing stocking density, we talked about the behaviour of pigs and the way they like to lie away from one another to lose heat. That's only possible if there's sufficient space around them to lie away from one another. So if you're feeling like they're trying to do that but are still fairly well heaped, it might be worth giving them that little bit extra space so that they can actually lie separately and lose heat. And as we've mentioned, mud wallows rather than pure water wallows will provide that sunscreen protection, but you could use sunscreen if you can't readily make a wallow in order to provide that direct sun exposure protection. And again, we've discussed the impact of feed in terms of feed intake, and also how feed will generate heat because of the processes that follow on as part of the basal metabolism. In terms of what to do with respect to feeding, if you have a screaming hot day, it would be worth feeding at cooler ends of the day, the early morning or evening, because you're more likely to get pigs willing to eat if it isn't in the midday screaming heat. They're just going to want to lie and try and lose as much heat as possible. They're not going to be interested in feeding, so feed them at a time of day that's more appropriate. If you're finding that feed intakes are reducing significantly due to hot weather, it might be worth considering having a summer specification of diet and a winter specification of diet, so that you can still achieve the same energy and nutrient intakes that you require, but maybe with the pigs taking it in a lower volume because they don't want to eat as much. This is particularly important with lactating sows with respect to their energy intake, and also the amino acid lysine, because those are vital for maintaining milk production and also her own body condition. And the other major nutrient is water. And it really is vital. You can see the percentage of a pig's body which is actually really water, and therefore how important it is for just maintaining the basic body processes. Water ideally should be ad lib, available all the time in a clean and palatable form. It's not ideal to, particularly in hot weather, to have pigs in a situation where they can't ad lib access water, because they could easily drain that water supply before you realize that they have done, and therefore it might be a period of time that they go where they don't have access to water if it isn't actually plumbed in and ad lib. Making sure that pigs' drinkers and troughs are cleaned out regularly so that the water doesn't become spoiled. It is difficult in the summer because sometimes pigs will have a tendency to try and get into their troughs in order to use evaporative cooling, and therefore the troughs become soiled more frequently. But if you can attempt to keep them as clean as possible, it will maintain water intake, which in turn will help to maintain feed intake. Trying to keep a separate drinking water supply to wallow troughs and wallow, so the pigs aren't feeling that they need to drink the water that they're actually wallowing in, because that can become easily soiled with urine and feces. And obviously most wallows you're attempting to make a muddy soup rather than liquid that's readily drinkable. Also maintaining adequate flow rates and making sure that when you have a number of pigs utilising the same water line, that flow rate through each of the watering points is maintained, so that at points of high usage you don't find some groups of pigs going short because either the line or the delivery or the drink or the water pressure is unable to maintain flow rates through those drinker points. You can see in the table on the right hand side a guide to different categories of animal and their daily water requirements, and also the ideal flow rate through their drinkers. And anything that hinders water intake, such as palatability or quality or poor flow rate or pressure, will then lead to issues associated, such as feed intake reduction, growth rate reduction, and as we've talked about a couple of times before, the milk production in sows, and therefore body condition loss. And it increases the risk of urinary tract infections if they become partially dehydrated because they haven't got ready access to water. It is more likely for them to get things like cystitis or pyelonephritis and have those negative knock-on effects. So that's the end. It's quite a lot to cover, so I thought it was important for me to cite some of the references that I've used to put together this presentation. There is information from the UK, from AHGB Pork and APHA, as well as NARDIS, as well as a really comprehensive guide of preparing pigs for summer months from the Australian pork industry. And within that, there's a really comprehensive amount of information available out there in terms of tips and tricks and things that you can do in order to try and prepare yourself and your pigs to survive hot weather and continue to perform well during hot weather. And that's the end. So it's time for Q&A.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alex, for such an informative session. Briefly, before we move on to the Q&A, I'd just like to mention a few things that are coming up with Menter Moch Cymru that may be of interest to you. Firstly, we've got a few other webinars coming up over the next few weeks. We've got one on the 29th of July, which is looking at the weaning process, and that's being delivered by Alan Stewart from Harper Adams University. And then we've also got one on the 30th of July at 8 o'clock, looking at farm diversification, are pigs an option on your farm? That was looking at pig keeping on more of a commercial scale. It will also be interesting for current pig keepers, as we will have Mick Sloyan, who was previously the strategic director for AHDB Pork, and he's given us an overview and an update on the pig sector and what are the likely effects of COVID, Brexit, export demand, etc. So still might be a really good, interesting webinar for current pig keepers as well. We've also got the resource hub, so if you've not checked that out yet, that's on our website, and it's got a wealth of information. We've got fact sheets, we have monthly technical articles, we have recordings from all of our webinars, and but we also have other resources and free farm materials. So check that out on our website. And finally, just to remind you that the project does offer funding for herd health plans. So further information can be found on the website, or contact us directly, and we can answer any questions that you have. So now, moving on to the Q&A session. If you've not already posted your questions, you do still have some time. In the meantime, we'll start going through some of the questions that have already come in. So the first one for you, Alex, first one has